Hey everyone, Chris here with another filler video. Now for this one, I decided to take a quick look back at an old NES title few people talked about back when it was new, few people talked about following, yet is perhaps more influential to both retro and modern game design than you may expect. That game being Air Fortress, which takes place in outer space, so we've already got a misnomer for a title. In any case, this was a game made by HAL Laboratory way back in 1987, well before Nintendo started hitting them up to develop first-party titles. So Nintendo really didn't have anything to do with this one. Now, there's technically a story to this game, but I have a feeling it was translated poorly, as it doesn't make any sense really. But the basic gist is that mysterious fortresses have started cropping up near the planet Farmo, which are destroying pretty much everything they come in contact with. So a new strategy is formed to send in a lone soldier by the name of Hal Bailman riding a tiny light ship, able to penetrate the outer defenses of the fortresses, get inside, blow the reactors, and escape before everything goes thermonuclear. Pretty typical sci-fi fare really, and likely inspired by the Star Wars movies, at least to some extent. There are a total of 8 fortresses to take out, and each one has 2 distinct sequences you play through. The initial approach, followed by the incursion deep into the fortress. Now the approach is done pretty much as a straight-up 2D shooter, where you die in one hit and have 3 lives. But what's interesting is that there's more to this approach than just surviving and shooting down enemies. Along the way, you find energy and beam power-ups which add to a running total seen up in the top left corner. Now in order to stand a chance once you get into the fortress itself, it's important to power yourself up as much as you can. Each approach has various fixed power-ups to acquire, but defeating enemies also runs the possibility of getting random drops, with some kinds of enemies having higher drop rates than others. There's also 2 special kinds of power-ups you can acquire during the approach, which don't show up deep in the fortress. The diamond power-up makes you immune to damage for a moment, though you can still die from smashing into the environment, while the plus power-up is a screen-clearing attack. With both of these, it's often a good idea to wait until the last possible second to collect them to get the most use out of them, especially considering that no matter how you defeat an enemy, it rolls its chance to drop another item. Once you get to the end of the approach, Hal lands his light ship, dismounts, and walks inside ready to do battle. Now, this is where things get really interesting. That energy gauge you have actually works in a very unique way, as it has both a current level and a maximum level. Now, anytime you perform an action of any kind, be it firing your blaster, using your jetpack to fly, or even just walking around, you lose energy. But when you're not touching the controls at all, your energy rapidly recharges back up to maximum. Yet, this energy is also your health. If you take a hit from an enemy, you lose some energy, but also lose some maximum energy. Thus, the total amount of energy you can now recharge up to drops. This method of sharing the same energy level for both attack and defense, but recharging any energy used intentionally and not recharging any energy used to keep you alive, is an extremely clever mechanic, and it's one which I myself have been wanting to use in one of my game ideas for quite some time now. Now, granted, it's kinda annoying that you can only see the current energy level and not the maximum, but given the limitations of the NES hardware, I at least understand why that would have made things too complicated at best, or extremely flickery at worst, so it's not that big a deal. Underneath the energy gauge, though, is your gauge for Hal's Crash Beam weapon. This weapon fires in the same manner as the regular blaster, except the shots explode on impact, and the explosion itself does damage with every frame of contact, making it extraordinarily powerful and kinda necessary for taking out difficult targets. Plus, a few of the fortresses have special walls in the way which can only be taken out with the Crash Beam, whereas most everything else is vulnerable to the blaster. Now, so far, apart from the energy mechanics, the raw gameplay itself is going to seem pretty standard here in the fortress as well. Save for being able to take a metric ton of hits before going down, but considering that energy and beam refill power-ups are not easy to come across in the fortresses, and it makes sense that the game starts you with these numbers really high, with the trick now being to keep those numbers from dropping too low. It's also neat that you use a jetpack instead of jumping. And then there's also a recoil mechanic, whereby every time you fire a shot, you get knocked back a short distance by the recoil. And while this may seem annoying, using recoil to your advantage is required to survive some of the later fights without getting absolutely destroyed. So it's good to learn how to use the recoil to your advantage. But then, you finally find it. The reactor core. By the way, touching the core is instant death, so don't ever do that. Instead, take aim with your blaster and just lay into it as fast as you can, as the core constantly regenerates its hit points, so you need to fire fast and furiously to take it out that way. Or 4 or 5 crash beam shots will generally be enough, and then... yeah, everything goes dark once the core is gone. In the first fortress here, this is pretty inconsequential. The escape hatch is right behind the core. But when you blow the core in the second fortress, you're going to notice the teleport tube doesn't bring you back to where you would expect it to, forcing you to retrace some of your steps, and before long, the whole place starts shaking. The whole core blowing mechanic is also kind of mind-blowing for a game this old. Now sure, Metroid did this kind of thing a full year prior, as when you took out Mother Brain, you'd have to perform an escape through a tunnel, but there weren't really any good effects to convey the severity of that situation, just a countdown timer. Here, you don't even get a timer, but if you stick around too long, things will get worse and worse, as what little light remains starts fading in and out, and then the shaking gets worse, the noise of the shaking gets louder, and if you take too long... yep, you're toast. Now, the first few fortresses are fairly linear, so getting out isn't too big of a challenge, but that leads into another thing that's kind of nice about this game, is that the difficulty curve itself is entirely linear, going up at a steady pace, making things more challenging with each fortress cleared. Now, the fourth fortress is probably the first real test of your skills, because it's a very non-linear place. Thus, figuring out how to safely make your way out before you blow the reactor is extremely important, so that you'll have enough time to make it out alive. Not to mention, this gives you a chance to clear the path, as most enemies in the game do not respawn. Well, a handful do, and some enemies are keyed not to spawn in until the reactor is blown, but for the most part, most enemies stay gone once defeated. That said though, I think this game gets a little too hard. Now, as a kid, I never made it past the 5th fortress, and as an adult, prior to making this video, I never made it past the 7th fortress. Well, I mentioned the difficulty curve is linear, but it's also steep, getting more and more difficult every step of the way. With the last 3 fortresses in particular, there's pretty much no way to complete them on your first visit, as they're incredibly maze-like with too many enemies to evade completely. Your first visit or 3 to these fortresses will primarily be to map them out. Then, once you see the actual path you need to take, you can do so and avoid every single area, which serves no purpose whatsoever, other than to drain you down. Fortunately, the game isn't quite so hardcore, as it is a continue system, and it's probably the best continue system in any NES game which doesn't have battery-backed up save slots. The way it works is when you first boot the game, if you go to continue, it'll ask for a password. The notion being that since you just started playing and want to continue, you must have a password related to where you left off, with each password only being 4 characters long. However, if you run out of lives during an approach or die in the fortress itself and go back to the title screen, selecting continue immediately brings you back to the approach for the fortress where you died. No passwords required. Well, that said, I finally did make it to the last fortress for sake of this video, and holy freaking heck is it hard! The last fortress is not only ginormous and a freaking maze of teleports and elevators, but it features a couple unique enemies which only show up there, along with an escape sequence which is so incredibly tight that the first time I managed to survive long enough to get through the final room, I only needed 2 more seconds and I would have made it out. But, after multiple more attempts, I finally made it, and... yeah, I actually already knew about this, but never witnessed this screen for myself until now. The game has a second loop to it, much like Ghosts and Goblins before it. And it does some palette alterations, adds a whole bunch more enemies, changes up some of the locations the teleporters take you to inside the fortresses. You're basically just supposed to play through the entire game a second time, but with the difficulty cranked up another notch. No, that's fine. After trying to get through the final fortress nearly a dozen times, I think I've had my fill of this game this time around. But really, despite how hard this game gets, it is a proper linear increase in difficulty, coupled with unique mechanics and an incredibly well done presentation, being very simple, but surprisingly deep as well. However, if you go looking into the reviews this game got back when it was brand new or even now, you're going to see that most of them are only middle of the road or slightly above average, with only a tiny handful of people seeing the brilliance here. Now that's because the mechanics really don't shine until you get further in beyond the initial introductory parts of the game. Since if those mechanics were put to their maximum potential too early, it'd be super frustrating for the player to deal with. Because the game starts easy and gradually gets harder, it gives the wrong impression to anyone who only sits down with it for a couple fortresses. And it's only really when you get to the fourth fortress where it suddenly starts making sense how all of these mechanics intertwine to make for an ingenious experience. Air Fortress also has the honor of being the second game I ever picked up loose from a pawn shop with my own money, way back in the early 90s. And the first such game was Bomberman, and the third was Pipe Dream. So I've had it for a very long time, and whether it was directly influential to general game design or not, there's no denying the parallels between what's here and what's shown up in games since. Again, this game was released in 1987. To put that in perspective, other games which came out the same year for the NES include the original Final Fantasy, the very first Mega Man game, and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. And when compared to those games, it really does hold up in terms of raw gameplay, even if those games did indeed have more depth to them. Actually, 1987 was the breakout year for the NES, where games finally started getting more complex. Thus, Air Fortress kind of feels more like an 86 game rather than an 87 game, and that's probably factored into its review scores to some extent. This is also one of the easiest console games to get a legit copy of nowadays, given the extremely hostile nature of the console and portable gaming market right now. Loose carts tend to run between $8 and $10, while fully boxed copies run between $20 and $30. Sealed copies, though, just forget about it. Unlike PC gaming, where you can still find some sealed games for reasonable prices, the retro console and portable gaming markets have absolutely gone insane when it comes to sealed copies. And this game itself will even touch triple-digit prices nowadays. Unless you're a hardcore collector with no real interest in playing the games you collect, it's really not worth going for a sealed copy of this game, or really any console or portable games anymore. Anywho, that'll be all for this filler video. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now, on August 5th, will be a proper Ancient DOS Games review, episode 315, where we're finally going to be taking a look at one of the top requested games in my request list that's been itching for a review for quite a while now. So definitely make sure to stay tuned, given how many of you have been wanting to see this game get covered. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me over on Patreon. If you'd also like to support the show directly and get some extra perks, then head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.